He died a soldier for a criminal regime, a useful propaganda tool for Goebbels. He was a relic of a decadent aristocracy, a member of a class his own Führer privately despised and planned to purge. And yet, his funeral became the largest spontaneous demonstration of public dissent in the history of the Third Reich. He was mourned by over 50,000 people as a beloved hero, a true martyr, in an event that sent a shockwave of terror directly to Adolf Hitler. His name was Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. How could this one man's death be both a glorious sacrifice for the Reich and a profound act of public rebellion against it? This is the story of the man born to rule an empire, but destined only to haunt it. Today we are digging into the dark facts surrounding his life, the controversial marriage that cost him a crown, the tragic death that served a regime that betrayed him, and the astonishing funeral that became an act of defiance. This is the story of the Hohenzollern family's fraught and ultimately ruinous dance with Nazism. The tragic thread that entwined this man's life began to unravel not in 1940, but on July 4th, 1906, the day he was born. Let's go back to a time when everything seemed eternal. On that day at the Marmor Palais, or Marble Palace in Potsdam, a son was born to Crown Prince Wilhelm and his young wife, Duchess Cecilia of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. The birth of a firstborn son to the heir of the German Empire was a state event. Cannons fired salutes. Telegrams flew across the empires of the world. He was given a suitably grand name, Wilhelm Friedrich Franz Joseph Christian Olaf, and from his first breath he was given the title Kaiserliche Hoheit, Imperial Highness. His grandfather was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the bombastic, impulsive, and deeply insecure man who sat on the imperial throne. His father, the crown prince, was a dashing, athletic, and notoriously unfaithful figure, a playboy prince who was the darling of the public, but a source of constant frustration for his own father. His mother, Duchess Cecilia, was one of the most beloved women in Germany, admired for her grace, fashion, and quiet dignity in the face of her husband's very public infidelities. Young Wilhelm was the future. He was the next link in the chain that stretched back to Frederick the Great. He and his 5 siblings, Louis Ferdinand, Hubertus, Friedrich, Alexandrine, and Cecilia, were raised in a bubble of unimaginable privilege. Their world was the opulent palaces of Berlin and Potsdam. Their days were governed by rigid timetables, overseen by a phalanx of tutors, governesses, and military adjutants. The core of this upbringing was Prussianism. It was a philosophy of duty, discipline, Lutheran piety, and above all, military service. From the moment he could walk, young Wilhelm was dressed in miniature military uniforms. He learned to ride, to shoot, and to stand at attention. He was taught that his family's right to rule was ordained by God, and that his ultimate purpose was to serve the German state as its future emperor. It was an upbringing that forged character, but it was also one that stifled individuality. Wilhelm grew into a sensitive, intelligent, and somewhat reserved young man. He was less of a firebrand than his grandfather, less of a hedonist than his father. He was, by many accounts, a gentler soul, more inclined to scholarly pursuits than to the parade ground. But in the house of Hohenzollern, personal inclination was secondary to dynastic duty. He was the heir to the heir, and his path was set in stone, or so it seemed. Then came 1914, the Great War, the cataclysm that the Kaiser and his generation had so eagerly stumbled into. Wilhelm's father, the Crown Prince, was given nominal command of the Fifth Army and became the Butcher of Verdun, a title he earned for presiding over one of the most senseless and bloody slaughters in human history. For 4 years, the German Empire bled, And in 1918, it broke. For 12-year-old Prince Wilhelm, the world didn't just change, it evaporated. It was a trauma from which his family and his nation would never fully recover. The mutinies at Kiel, the workers' revolutions in Berlin, the stab-in-the-back myth that the army had been betrayed by politicians. It was a tidal wave of chaos. On November 9, 1918, his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate. He fled by train into exile in the Netherlands, eventually settling at Huisdoorn, a manor house that would become his gilded cage and his final resting place. The German Empire was dead. In its place, a new, fragile, and deeply resented government was born, the Weimar Republic. The psychological impact on the Hohenzollern family cannot be overstated. They had lost everything, not just their throne, but their power, their purpose, and in their own minds, their honor. Young Wilhelm was no longer Imperial Highness. He was no longer the future emperor. He was, in the eyes of the new republic, simply Wilhelm Prince von Preußen, a citizen with a once noble name. The family was stripped of many of its properties, though they were allowed to keep significant wealth in several estates, including Oels in Silesia and Sicilienhof in Potsdam, which had been built for his parents. But it was the bitterness that defined them. The air Wilhelm breathed as a teenager was thick with resentment. His grandfather, in his Dutch exile, spent his days chopping wood and writing furious anti-Semitic tirades, blaming Jews and socialists for his downfall. His father, the Crown Prince, was also exiled for a time on the barren island of Wieringen before being allowed to return to Germany in 1923. Where he lived the life of a discontented private citizen, dabbling in politics and longing for a restoration. This was the shadowed upbringing of Prince Wilhelm. He was a prince with no kingdom, an heir with no inheritance. Unlike his ancestors, he could not be privately tutored for a life of rule. He was sent to a gymnasium, a public high school, in Potsdam. This in itself was a revolution. The future Kaiser was rubbing shoulders with the sons of merchants, lawyers, and civil servants. After high school, he did what many young men of his class did. He went to university. He studied law and political science at the universities of Königsberg, Munich, and Bonn. He was, by all accounts, a bright and diligent student, but the shadow of the past and the pull of tradition was inescapable. The family still saw itself as Germany's rightful rulers, and they despised the Weimar Republic. They hated its decadence, its democracy, its art, its perceived weakness. They were monarchists through and through, waiting for the day the Republic would fail. And this is where the dark undercurrent truly begins to pull. The family's bitterness and their anti-Republican sentiments made them fertile ground for the far-right ideologies that were bubbling up in the chaos of 1920s. Germany, they were not Democrats. They were authoritarians looking for a strong man who could crush the left, tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles, and they hoped restore the monarchy. Several members of Wilhelm's family found their strong man in the unlikely vulgar figure of Adolf Hitler. Wilhelm's uncle, Prince August Wilhelm, known as Aui, became a devoted, fanatical Nazi in the late 1920s. He joined the SA, the stormtroopers, and became a prize propaganda tool for Hitler, a real prince who endorsed the Nazi Party. He was a familiar, uniformed figure at their brutal rallies. Believing Hitler would make him Kaiser one day, Wilhelm's own father, the former Crown Prince, was also dangerously sympathetic. He saw in Hitler a useful tool, a battering ram to destroy the Republic. The Crown Prince met with Hitler several times, publicly endorsed him, and in 1932 he infamously supported Hitler for the presidency against the incumbent Paul von Hindenburg, the Hohenzollerns, or at least a significant faction of them, were making a deal with the devil, blinded by their own desperation to regain power. They believed they could control Hitler, use his populist movement for their own ends, and then discard him. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern history. This was the toxic, politically charged, and morally compromised world that Prince Wilhelm was navigating in his 20s. He was more reserved than his father or his uncle Aui. He was not a vocal Nazi. He seems to have kept his distance, focusing on his studies and, for a time, a brief stint in the Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army permitted to Germany, fulfilling his traditional military obligation. He was a young man trapped by his name, a name that represented a past that was dead, and a name that his family was now poisoning by associating it with a new thuggish movement. But while his family was desperately trying to forge a new political destiny, Prince Wilhelm was about to make a choice that was entirely his own. It wasn't a political rebellion. It was a personal one, a rebellion of the heart. In the early 1930s, as Germany was sliding inexorably into the darkness of the Nazi regime, Prince Wilhelm, the man who had lost a throne, fell deeply in love. And this one, pure act of personal happiness, would, in the twisted logic of his family, cost him everything he had left. The rebellion of Prince Wilhelm was not at first a political one. It was not a grand pronouncement against the Republic, nor was it an embrace of the new dark forces gathering in the beer halls of Munich. His rebellion was a quiet one, a personal one, and it began, as so many great rebellions do, with love. During his university days in Bonn, Wilhelm was, for perhaps the first time in his life, afforded a glimpse of normalcy. He was still a prince, of course, and his name preceded him everywhere. But the atmosphere of a university town, the intellectual debates, the relative freedom from the stifling protocol of his family's estates must have felt like breathing fresh air. And it was here, in this atmosphere, that he met Dorothea von Salviati. Now we must be very clear. Dorothea was not a peasant girl from a fairy tale. She was born in 1907, a contemporary of Wilhelm's, and she was herself an aristocrat. She was the daughter of Alexander Hermann von Salviati, a minor nobleman. Her lineage was respectable. Her family was good. But in the hopelessly rigid, stratified world of European high royalty, she was, in one crucial, fatal respect, unsuitable. She was not royal. She was not a princess from another German state, not a duchess from a reigning house, not a grand duchess from Russia. She did not have, in the cold, genealogical calculus of the Hohenzollern dynasty, equal blood. To us today, this distinction seems almost absurd, a historical curiosity steeped in snobbery. But to the House of Hohenzollern in the 1930s, it was everything. It was the law. Their romance, by all accounts, was genuine and deep. We can imagine them, two young people in their early 20s, meeting at a university function or a society ball, Wilhelm, the reserved, intelligent, and perhaps slightly melancholy prince, and Dorothea, who must have possessed a warmth and character that cut through his dynastic gloom. He saw in her perhaps not a suitable match, but a partner, a life, a refuge from the ghosts of his grandfather's empire and the dark ambitions of his father's political circle. He fell in love, and with that, he sealed his fate. When he announced his intention to marry Dorothea, the reaction from his family was not just disapproval, it was an explosion. The loudest, most furious voice, of course, came from the Netherlands. His grandfather, the 74-year-old, exiled Kaiser Wilhelm II, was apoplectic. From his gilded cage at Hoosdorn, the Kaiser still ruled his family with an iron fist. He was a man living entirely in the past, obsessed with his own historical importance, his divine right, and the absolute purity of his lineage. This news from his grandson was not a romance. It was an act of treason. It was a betrayal of the dynasty. It was, to his mind, a contamination of the sacred royal bloodline. The Kaiser forbade the marriage, absolutely, unequivocally. He was the chef des houses, the head of the house of Hohenzollern. His word was law. He demanded that his grandson end this infatuation immediately and seek out a bride of equal rank. His duty, the Kaiser would have raged in his letters, was not to his own selfish happiness, but to the future of the house. Then there was his father, the former crown prince. His reaction was perhaps even more cynical and certainly more hypocritical. The crown prince was a man who had spent his entire life chasing pleasure. His affairs were legendary. He had scandalized the family for decades with his philandering. He, of all people, understood passion, but he too was a prisoner of the family name. He may have privately sympathized with his son's desire for love, but dynastically he sided with the Kaiser. The crown prince was still desperately clinging to the fantasy that the monarchy could be restored. He was at this very moment consorting with Hitler, believing the Nazis could be his ticket back to power. And for that fantasy to work, the line of succession had to be impeccable. His heir, his firstborn son, could not throw it all away on a minor noblewoman. It was a staggering, crushing hypocrisy. The father, who had respected no vows, was demanding his son sacrifice true love for a dynastic fantasy. The family presented Wilhelm with an ultimatum. It was a choice that was almost medieval in its cruelty. He could have Dorothea, or he could have his birthright. He could not have both. If he chose to marry this unequal woman, he would be forced to sign a renunciation. He would have to formally, legally, and permanently give up his rights of succession. He would be cast out of the line, erased from the dynastic tree. His children would have no titles, no claim, no royal status whatsoever. He would be, for all intents and purposes, disinherited from the family business. This was the law of the morganatic marriage. This concept is key to understanding the tragedy of Wilhelm's life. A morganatic marriage was a union between a person of high rank and a person of lower rank, in which the lower-ranked partner and any children of the union had no claim on the higher partner's titles, privileges, or property. It was a way for royalty to protect their bloodlines from dilution. We've seen this before, of course. The most famous example would come a few years later in 1936, when Britain's King Edward VIII would abdicate to marry Wallis Simpson. But Wilhelm faced his choice first, and he faced it without the world's cameras, in the shadow of a rising dictatorship. Imagine the psychological pressure. Imagine the agonizing choice. On one hand, there was the weight of 1,000 years of history. His name, his grandfather, his father, the entire concept of duty that had been drilled into him since birth, the ghosts of Prussian kings and German emperors, all demanding sacrifice. And on the other hand, a woman he loved, the chance for a real life, a life of his own, not one lived as a pawn in his family's increasingly desperate and morally bankrupt political games. What was this birthright he was being asked to protect? It was the right to succeed to a throne that no longer existed. It was the privilege of being the future head of a family that was now actively collaborating with the thuggish, anti-Semitic Nazi party. He had seen his uncle, Aui, parading in an SA uniform. He had seen his own father cozying up to Hitler. Perhaps in his heart, Wilhelm saw that the birthright was already poisoned. Perhaps it was worthless. Perhaps choosing love was not an act of surrender, but his only act of true strength. His one defining act of freedom. He made his choice. On April 29, 1933, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia signed the document. He signed away his future. He renounced all rights of succession for himself and for his descendants. This is not just a date on a family document. This is a crucial, chilling, dark fact. Adolf Hitler had been Chancellor of Germany for exactly 3 months. The Reichstag fire had happened in February. The Enabling Act, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers, had been passed in March. The first concentration camp, Dachau, had already opened. Jewish businesses had been boycotted. Books were being burned. Germany was already a dictatorship. At the very moment his nation was surrendering its freedom to a monster, Wilhelm was surrendering his imperial destiny for a person. While his family was making their Faustian bargain with the Nazis, hoping to regain a crown, Wilhelm chose a wife instead. The family, defeated, gave their reluctant acceptance. The Kaiser was furious, but he couldn't stop it. The Crown Prince was disappointed, but his attention was on Hitler. The bond between Wilhelm and his family, especially his grandfather, was irrevocably fractured. On June 3, 1933, Wilhelm and Dorothea were married. They had a civil ceremony in Bonn, as required by German law, followed by a religious one at the town's Kreuzkirche. We can picture the wedding. It would have been intimate, beautiful, but undeniably shadowed. This was not a grand imperial affair with cheering crowds and visiting royalty. It was the quiet, defiant union of two people who had chosen each other against the world. His parents did attend, putting on a brave face, but the exiled Kaiser was conspicuously absent. His disapproval was a palpable ghost at the feast. The marriage, however, was by all accounts a happy one. Wilhelm had made his choice, and he found in it a peace that his dynastic life had never offered. He and Dorothea settled into a normal life, as normal as one could have with the name von Preußen in Nazi Germany. They had 2 children, 2 daughters. Princess Felicitas was born in 1934. Princess Christa followed in 1936. This is perhaps the most human and most heartbreaking part of the story. Wilhelm wasn't just a disinherited prince. He was a husband. He was a father. He had a family, a life he had built for himself, a life he had paid for with his royal inheritance. But this act of personal happiness had dark, unforeseen consequences. By renouncing his claim, Wilhelm had, in a way, made himself irrelevant to his own family's grand, restoration-obsessed narrative. He was no longer the primary heir. That role now fell to his younger, more pliable brother, Louis Ferdinand, who had spent time in America and was, ironically, far more skeptical of the Nazis than his father was. Wilhelm was now isolated. He was trapped in a terrible no-man's land. To the hardcore monarchists, he was a failure. The man who put love before duty. To his family, he was a disappointment. And to the Nazis, he was a curiosity. He was a member of the old decadent aristocracy who had proven himself weak by choosing a wife over his blood duty. Yet, he was still the Kaiser's grandson. He still had the most famous name in Germany. He had found his quiet life. He had his wife and his 2 little girls, but the world outside their home was becoming a roaring furnace. The regime that his father had helped into power was now absolute, and that regime, which had no use for him as a prince, would soon find a use for him as something else entirely, as a soldier. Wilhelm had found his personal peace. He had a wife he adored. He had 2 beautiful, healthy daughters. He had, in effect, traded a phantom crown for a tangible life. And it seemed, for a few short years, that he had won his gamble. But the nation in which he had chosen to build this quiet life was descending into a collective madness. The Germany of 1933, the year of his marriage, was a nation in chaos. The Germany of the late 1930s was a nation forged into a weapon. Adolf Hitler, the man his father and uncle had so disastrously misjudged, was no longer a chancellor. He was the Führer. The Gleichschaltung, or coordination, was complete. Every facet of German life, from the schools to the press to the judiciary to the workplace, was now controlled by the Nazi Party. The air was thick with uniforms. The ancient aristocratic traditions of Prussian militarism, which the Hohenzollerns had embodied, were being cynically hijacked, repainted, and absorbed into a new, far more brutal ideology. In 1935, Hitler tore up the Treaty of Versailles and reintroduced universal military conscription. The army, the Reichswehr, which had been limited to 100,000 men, was reborn as the Wehrmacht. It was a new, vast, and terrifyingly modern force. For a man like Prince Wilhelm, this was not just a political development. It was a personal one. He was, after all, a Hohenzollern. His very name was synonymous with the German military. For centuries, his ancestors had not just ruled, they had been soldiers. Frederick the Great, his legendary forebear, was a general first and a king second. His grandfather, the Kaiser, had famously loved nothing more than to dress in ridiculous manly uniforms. His own father had commanded an army at Verdun. This tradition, this sense of duty, was drilled into them from birth. It was as much a part of their DNA as their blue blood. And so, in the late 1930s, as Germany rearmed and the drums of war beat louder, Prince Wilhelm did what was expected of him. He was already a reserve officer, but now he re-entered active service. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Heer, the German army. This is a crucial detail. He was not given a comfortable, high-ranking ceremonial position as a prince. He was not made a general and given a staff to shuffle papers in Berlin. He was a lieutenant, and later an Oberleutnant, an officer in the infantry. He was expected to train, to lead men, and, if war came, to fight. But what exactly was he fighting for? This is the dark, tangled heart of his story. He was a man serving a regime that was, at that very moment, plotting the destruction of his class, his family, and everything he represented. To understand this catastrophic irony, we must look at the toxic, fractured, and deluded state of the Hohenzollern family in the age of Hitler. The family was torn apart by its own Faustian bargain. Let's start with his uncle, Prince August Wilhelm, or Aui. By the late 1930s, Aui was a pathetic but dangerous figure. He was a true believer, a fanatical Nazi. He had joined the party early, parading in his brown shirt, SA uniform, a prize propagandist for Goebbels. He was a real prince, proof that the old aristocracy endorsed the new regime. He held the rank of Obergruppenführer in the SA and a seat in the rubber-stamped Reichstag. He was a family embarrassment to some, a visionary to others. He was, in truth, a fool, a man who still believed Hitler would, any day now, reward his loyalty by placing him or his father on a restored throne. He was a constant living reminder of the family's deepest, most grotesque collaboration. Then there was his father, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm. By this point, the Crown Prince knew he had been played. He was 57 years old, a man whose entire life had been a waiting game for a throne that was now gone forever. His early support for Hitler, his belief that he could use the Nazis, had proven to be a catastrophic fantasy. Hitler had used him. The Crown Prince was now marginalized, a relic living on his estates. He was a ghost in his own home at Sicilienhof. He had no power, no influence. The Nazis, who had once courted him, now openly mocked him in private. Hitler had no intention of restoring the monarchy. He had in fact privately assured his inner circle that the monarchy was a pestilence that needed to be exterminated. The Crown Prince's disillusionment was bitter. He was reportedly heard complaining in the privacy of his aristocratic circles about the regime's vulgarity. He was horrified by the Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938, not necessarily from a place of deep moral conviction. The family was casually anti-Semitic, as was much of the European aristocracy, but because it was disorderly, undignified, and bad for Germany's image. He was a man complaining about the interior decorating while the house burned to the ground. He was trapped, a bitter, aging playboy who had backed the wrong horse and now had to live with the consequences, offering weak, ineffectual private criticism while still maintaining a public facade of support. And finally, in the Netherlands, there was the patriarch, the old exiled Kaiser, Wilhelm II. From Hoosdorn, the Kaiser watched Hitler's rise with a toxic mix of envy, disdain, and delusional hope. He despised Hitler, the vulgar Austrian corporal. He loathed the thuggery of the SA and the pagan, anti-Christian elements of the Nazi Party, but he loved the rearmament. He was thrilled to see the German military, his military, rise from the shame of Versailles. He saw the Wehrmacht not as a Nazi tool, but as the glorious rebirth of his Prussian army. He was a man so blinded by his own militaristic obsession that he couldn't see, or perhaps refused to see, that the army's soul had been corrupted. He deluded himself into thinking that this was all a precursor to his return, that once Germany was strong again, the army, in its old Prussian loyalty, would rise up, cast Hitler aside, and call him home to the throne. This was the mad, contradictory, and poisonous atmosphere that Prince Wilhelm, the young lieutenant, had to navigate. His uncle was a Nazi fanatic. His father was a bitter, duped collaborator. His grandfather was a deluded megalomaniac, cheering for the army of a man he despised. So where did Wilhelm himself stand? All historical accounts suggest he was not a Nazi. He was never a member of the party. He was not politically active like Aui, nor was he a schemer like his father. His neutrality was likely a quiet, aristocratic disdain. He was a man of the old world, a conservative, a nationalist, and an anti-communist. Certainly, he would have shared his class's fear of Bolshevism. He would have felt a surge of pride at the sight of a rearmed Germany. But his primary loyalty, his code, was the old Prussian one: duty. This was the fatal flaw of the Prussian officer corps. It was a code that demanded loyalty to the state, to Germany. Regardless of the political leadership, the oath they swore was, by 1934, not to a constitution, but to the person of Adolf Hitler. Many, like Wilhelm, likely rationalized this. They told themselves they were serving their country, not the party. They were serving in spite of the vulgar Nazis, not because of them. This was the tragic, self-deceiving tightrope they walked. Wilhelm, the sensitive, intelligent man who had given up a throne for love, now put on the Feldgrau uniform of the Wehrmacht. He was a dutiful son of Prussia, reporting for duty to a regime that represented the very antithesis of the chivalric monarchical code he was raised to believe in. He was a father of 2 young girls. He had a life, a real happy life, to lose. But the call of tradition, the inescapable gravity of his name, pulled him in. And then in September 1939, the abstraction of duty became a brutal, shocking reality. At that time, Hitler invaded Poland. The world plunged into war. Prince Wilhelm's unit was not part of this initial invasion, but the war struck the Hohenzollern family almost immediately. This dark fact is a chilling precursor, a dress rehearsal for Wilhelm's own fate. Wilhelm had a cousin, Prince Oscar of Prussia. Oscar was another of the Kaiser's sons, Wilhelm's uncle, and his son, also named Oscar, Prince Oscar Jr., was a 25-year-old lieutenant, just like Wilhelm. He was serving with Infantry Regiment 51. On September 5, 1939, only 4 days into the invasion, young Oscar's unit was engaged in heavy fighting near Wegro, Poland. He was wounded by artillery fire. He died of his injuries the next day. He was the very first German prince, the first member of any high royal house to be killed in the Second World War. The news hit the Hohenzollern family like a thunderclap. This was not a distant, glorious war of telegrams and headlines. It was real. It was blood. It was their blood. The Nazis for a moment saw a propaganda opportunity. Here was a prince, a grandson of the Kaiser, sacrificing himself for the new Reich. Goebbels' machinery began to spin a tale of national unity, of the old aristocracy and the new order fighting and dying together. But they miscalculated badly. The funeral for Prince Oscar Jr. was held in Potsdam, at the same Friedenskirche where Wilhelm's own parents had married. And something happened that no one, least of all the Gestapo, had anticipated. A crowd turned up. A massive crowd. Thousands upon thousands of people, ordinary citizens of Potsdam and Berlin, lined the streets. They were not there for a Nazi rally. They were there for a royal funeral. They were quiet, they were somber, and their presence was an act of defiance. They were mourning not just a young soldier, but the son of a prince, the grandson of their Kaiser. It was a spontaneous, shocking, and unmistakable outpouring of monarchist sympathy. The Nazi leadership was furious. This wasn't supposed to happen. The funeral had stolen the narrative. The public's grief was for the Hohenzollerns, not for the Reich. It was a reminder that even after 20 years, the ghost of the monarchy was still powerful. It was a rival loyalty, a rival narrative, and Hitler tolerated no rivals. For Prince Wilhelm, this event must have been a profound, terrifying premonition. His cousin, a man his own age, with a life just like his, was dead. He had seen the regime's cynical attempt to exploit the death, and he had seen the public's dangerous, defiant reaction. He now knew, with chilling certainty, what his duty entailed. He knew the risks, and he knew that if he fell, his death would not be his own. It would be a political event, a symbol to be fought over by a public that still remembered his family, and a regime that was desperate to make them forget. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was the Sitzkrieg, the phony war. But as spring approached, the Wehrmacht gathered its strength for the real prize. France, Prince Wilhelm, now an experienced first lieutenant, was with his unit, Infantry Regiment 1, part of the 1st Infantry Division. They were being moved to the west. He would have had leave, a chance to go home to Sicilienhof, or his own home and see his family. We can only imagine that final goodbye. His wife, Dorothea, his 2 little girls, Felicitas, now 6, and Christa, just 4. Did he hold them and wonder what this duty was really worth? Did he look at the life he had built, the life he had chosen, and feel the cold dread of knowing he was about to risk it all for a cause he did not believe in, for a Führer he did not respect, in a war that had already taken his cousin? He was a prince who had renounced his throne. He was a father who adored his children, and he was a soldier marching in an army that was about to unleash hell on Europe. He was a man walking dutifully and inexorably into his own tragedy. The spring of 1940 was beautiful. By all accounts, the weather in Western Europe was warm and clear, but on May 10th, this idyllic spring was shattered by the scream of dive bombers and the clatter of tank treads. The phony war was over. Fallgelb, or Case Yellow, the German invasion of France and the Low Countries, had begun. It was a new kind of war. It was not the static, grinding trench warfare his father had known at Verdun. This was blitzkrieg, a lightning war of speed, terror, and relentless synchronized violence. The main German thrust, a sickle cut, sliced through the impassable Ardennes forest, outflanking the mighty Maginot Line and the entire Allied army, trapping them against the sea. Prince Wilhelm, the Oberleutnant of the 1st Infantry Division, was not with that main armored spearhead. He was part of the Northern Pincer, Army Group B, which had smashed into the Netherlands and Belgium. His was the grinding, brutal, and essential work of the infantry, to follow the tanks, to clear out the pockets of resistance, to secure the flanks, and to keep pushing for 2 weeks. It was a blur of exhausting marches, terrifyingly sudden firefights, and the constant unnerving sight of a collapsing world. The roads were choked, not with military traffic, but with a river of human misery, refugees, their belongings piled onto carts and perambulators, their faces stunned with disbelief. They were fleeing the Wehrmacht. They were fleeing him. By May 22nd, the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army were in a desperate, chaotic retreat toward the coast. They were falling back to a town that would soon become legendary, Dunkirk. But to get there, they had to hold a defensive line. Pockets of that line were strong, held by men who were fighting for their lives. One of those strong points was the ancient French fortress town of Valenciennes. This is where Prince Wilhelm's war and his life reached its brutal climax. His division, the 1st, was tasked with pushing through this area, clearing the Escaut line, a network of defenses along the river. The fighting was not a walkover. The French and British, who had been ordered to stand and fight, did so with ferocious, desperate courage. On May 23, 1940, Prince Wilhelm was at the front. This is perhaps the most vital part of the Prussian Code. An officer, a Junker, a prince, did not lead from a bunker 3 miles back. He led from the front. He had to be seen by his men. He had to share their risk. It was the only way to command their respect. It was the core of his identity. It was also, in this new war of high explosives and machine guns, a death sentence. We don't know the exact minute-by-minute details. They are lost, like so many individual stories, in the fog of that chaotic battle. But we know what happened. His unit was advancing, perhaps trying to clear a fortified farmhouse or cross a canal under fire. The resistance was heavy mortars, machine gun fire, and the one thing that infantrymen dread most, artillery. In 1940, artillery was becoming a science. It was impersonal, and it was devastating. A single unseen shell, fired from miles away, arcs through the clear May sky. It exploded in a deafening, concussion-filled roar. Hot, jagged shrapnel, the splinters of the shell casing, tore through the air at supersonic speed. Wilhelm went down. There was no glory in it, no dramatic last stand, just a sudden, searing, incomprehensible pain. The men around him, seeing their officer fall, would have rushed to him. The cry of "Sanitator," "Medic," would have gone up. The wound was immediately, obviously catastrophic. He had taken the full force of the shrapnel in his abdomen. This was and still is one of the most horrific wounds a human can suffer on the battlefield. He was alive, he was conscious, and he was in agony. He was immediately evacuated. This was not a slow horse-drawn cart. This was the new mechanized army. He was stabilized as best they could, a pressure dressing, a desperate shot of morphine, and rushed back from the front line. He crossed the border from France into Belgium to the nearest main Feld Lazaret, the German field hospital. It was in a requisitioned building in the town of Nivelles. We can picture the scene. A former school, or perhaps a monastery, its hallways now smelling not of chalk or incense, but of ether, carbolic acid, and the sweet, sickly stench of gangrene. The corridors would be lined with stretchers, filled with the broken bodies of young men, German and Allied alike. The sounds would be a low symphony of moans, of quiet weeping, and of surgeons, exhausted and blood-soaked, giving curt, necessary orders. This was the gruesome reality of battlefield medicine in 1940. This was the dark, terrible truth of glorious sacrifice. He was a prince. He was the Kaiser's grandson. He would have been given priority. He would have been seen by the best surgeons at the hospital. They would have rushed him into a makeshift operating theater. But what could they do? This was a world before penicillin, the mass production of antibiotics. The one thing that could have saved him was still 3 years away, a closely guarded Allied secret. For an abdominal wound like Wilhelm's, the enemy was not the shrapnel itself. The enemy was what the shrapnel had done. It had torn through his intestines. It had ruptured his organs. It was now leaking bacteria and waste into his body cavity. The surgeons would have done their best. They would have operated a desperate laparotomy, trying to find and clamp the bleeding, to suture the torn bowels. They would have cleaned the wound with what they had. They had sulfa drugs, a new powder they could pack into the wound, which offered a sliver of hope against infection. But for this level of trauma, it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. The enemy was infection, sepsis, peritonitis, his own body poisoned from within. For 3 days, he lingered. This, perhaps, is the most tragic part of all. He did not die instantly on the battlefield. A hero's death. He was given 3 days. 3 days to lie in a strange, sterile, hopeless room, far from home, and know he was dying. He was 33 years old. He was a man who had chosen love, a man with a wife, Dorothea, whom he had defied an empire to marry, a man with 2 little girls, Felicitas and Christa, ages 6 and 4. What must have gone through his mind in those last lucid hours? Did he see their faces? Did he clutch the small photos he surely carried in his tunic pocket? Did he feel the crushing, pointless waste of it all? He had renounced his birthright, his phantom throne, precisely to have this life, to be a husband, a father. And now that precious, hard-won life was being stolen from him. And for what? For a duty that had him fighting for a regime he didn't respect? For a Führer who saw his entire class as a pestilence? For a war of aggression that had already consumed his cousin? We can never know. But we know that for 3 days he fought. And on May 26, 1940, his body could fight no more. Surrounded by strangers in a Belgian town he had never heard of, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia died. The news of his death flashed from the field hospital to Army Group B headquarters, and from there to Berlin. It landed on the desks of the High Command and, crucially, on the desk of Dr. Joseph Goebbels at the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Here was a dark fact that was also a golden opportunity, or so it seemed. The Kaiser's grandson, the eldest son of the Crown Prince, had died a hero's death, a Heldentod, for the fatherland, for the Führer. This was pure propaganda gold. This was the proof that the new Reich was a grand synthesis of the old Prussian virtues and the new National Socialist dynamism. It was the perfect symbol of national unity. Here was a prince sacrificing his blue blood on the same altar as the common farmer's son Goebbels's machine began to spin. The newspapers were prepared. The heroic narratives were drafted. This was a gift. But then, a note of caution. The leaders in Berlin, Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, remembered they had a file. They remembered what had happened just 9 months earlier at the funeral of his cousin, Prince Oscar Jr. They had intended that death to be a propaganda victory, too. And what had it become? It had become a spontaneous, massive, and deeply monarchist demonstration, thousands of people right under the nose of the Gestapo, weeping not for a soldier of the Reich, but for a prince of the Hohenzollerns. It was a chilling reminder that the old loyalties were not dead. They were just sleeping. Hitler was furious at that memory. He tolerated no rivals, not political rivals, not religious rivals, and certainly not the ghosts of a rival dynasty. So the death of Prince Wilhelm presented a sudden, dangerous dilemma. His death was a fact, but the meaning of his death was now dangerously contested. On one hand, the propaganda ministry wanted to shout his name from the rooftops. On the other hand, the Gestapo and the SS were deeply, mortally afraid. They were terrified that if they glorified this prince, they wouldn't be strengthening the Reich. They would be reawakening the monarchy. This is the ultimate dark irony of Wilhelm's sacrifice. He was a high-born soldier, and his death exemplified his utter expendability in Hitler's war machine. He was just another officer sent to the front to do a dangerous job. But in his death, he suddenly became infinitely more powerful and infinitely more dangerous to the Nazi regime than he had ever been in his life. He was a symbol, a potential martyr. But a martyr for whom? For Hitler's Germany or for the Kaiser's vanished empire? The regime was about to find out, and the answer would shake the Third Reich to its foundations. The news of Prince Wilhelm's death landed like a bomb, first at his family's estates in Germany, and then at the quiet, exiled court of Huisdoorn in the Netherlands. For his grandfather, the 81-year-old Kaiser Wilhelm II, the news was a complex and devastating blow. This was the second grandchild he had lost in this new, terrible war. He was trapped. In a bitter, cruel irony, the very army his grandson had died for had just weeks earlier invaded and overrun the Netherlands, the country that had given him refuge for 22 years. He was now, quite literally, Hitler's prisoner. The Kaiser's grief was real, but it was, as always, poisoned by his ego and his delusions. He reportedly raged against the cowardice of the Allies, while simultaneously seeing in his grandson's death a glorious testament to the Hohenzollern family's unbreakable bond with the German military. He was a man drowning in his own contradictions, a pathetic, tragic figure, mourning his heir in a country occupied by the army. He both loathed and admired. Then there was his father, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm. The news shattered his world. This was his firstborn son, the son who had defied him, the son who had renounced his birthright for love, and in so doing had perhaps earned a respect his father could never articulate. The Crown Prince, the weak, vain, and aging playboy, was now just a grieving father. But even in this moment of pure human tragedy, the political calculus began. The regime, the Nazi leadership in Berlin, had to make a decision what to do with the body. Dr. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, saw the dilemma. His first instinct, and that of the party, was to use the death to spin it, control it, and turn it into a story that served the Reich. But they were haunted by the ghost of Prince Oscar's funeral just 9 months prior. That event, that spontaneous 10,000-strong monarchist demonstration, had been a stinging embarrassment. They were now facing the funeral of a far more significant figure, not the son of a fifth son, but the firstborn son of the Crown Prince, the direct heir, but for a morganatic marriage. The Gestapo and the SS were deeply, deeply nervous. They warned of a security risk. They warned that any public funeral would be a magnet for reactionary elements, their clinical, chilling term for anyone who still remembered the Kaiser. But Hitler and Goebbels had a problem. They couldn't not have a funeral. To do so, to bury the Kaiser's grandson in a quiet, unmarked grave, would be an insult. It would be a sign of weakness, or worse, of fear. It would anger the Wehrmacht's aristocratic officer corps, the very Vons and Zeus who Hitler needed to lead his armies, but privately despised it would be a propaganda disaster, a story for the British to seize upon. So they made a calculated and ultimately catastrophic decision. They would allow the funeral. They would even participate. They would send a high-ranking representative. They would try to co-opt the event. They would frame it not as the funeral of a prince, but as the glorious Heldentod, a hero's death of a soldier of the Reich. The swastika flag would fly. The military honors would be for the Wehrmacht, and the regime would publicly absorb this death into its own bloody mythology. They set the date, June 3rd, 1940, and they set the place, Potsdam. This choice of location was in itself a match thrown into a powder keg. Potsdam was not just another German city. It was the soul of the Hohenzollern dynasty. It was their answer to Versailles. It was the home of Sanssouci, the palace of Frederick the Great. It was the home of the Garnisonkirche, the spiritual heart of Prussian militarism. And it was the home of the Friedenskirche, the Church of Peace, the exquisite Italianate chapel in Sanssouci Park, where the service was to be held. It was, quite literally, the family's backyard. The German people at this moment were drunk on victory. Paris was about to fall. The British were being ignominiously bundled off the continent at Dunkirk. The Reich was triumphant, invincible. And in the midst of this nationalistic, arrogant euphoria, a different kind of news began to spread. It wasn't in the blazing headlines of the Völkischer Beobachter. It was a quiet notice, a black-bordered announcement in the papers. It was a murmur in the streets passed by word of mouth, from one old monarchist to another, from a shopkeeper to a postman, from a veteran of the Great War to his son. The prince is dead. They are burying him in Potsdam on Monday. On June 3rd, 1940, the day of the funeral, the Nazi leadership got their first inkling of what they had unleashed. The officials arrived in their black Mercedes, their uniforms crisp, their faces set in grim official mourning. There was, as promised, a high-level Nazi delegation. There were generals from the Wehrmacht High Command. The family arrived veiled and draped in black. The Crown Prince, a broken man, supported by his other sons, including the new heir, Louis Ferdinand. And there, a figure of profound tragedy, was the 33-year-old widow, Dorothea. The woman who had been deemed unworthy of a crown, now a widow because of a war waged by the very people who had scorned her. But it was not the family, and not the Nazis, that made this day historic. It was the people. They had started coming at dawn. They came by train from Berlin. They came on bicycles. They walked from the surrounding villages. They were not the young, fanatical Hitler youth. They were the old Germany. They were middle-aged women in their Sunday best. They were old men, some of them wearing their pour le mérite, or iron crosses from the last war. They were shopkeepers, civil servants, and former soldiers. The Gestapo's initial estimates were for a few thousand. They were wrong. By the time the funeral procession began, the streets of Potsdam were not just lined, they were full. A sea of black, silent, and somber humanity. The crowd was estimated at over 50,000 people. Let's be clear. This was the largest non-state organized, spontaneous public gathering in the history of the Third Reich. This was not a rally. This was not a protest. It was a funeral. And its power was terrifying. The Gestapo and SS observers mingling in the crowd in their leather coats were frantic. They were taking notes. They were filming with 8mm cameras. And the reports they were sending back to Berlin were laced with pure, unadulterated panic. This is the dark fact, the part that was immediately classified, the part that terrified Hitler. The crowd was not acting as it should. They were not giving the Nazi salute as the military delegation passed. They were largely silent. As the coffin draped in the Reichskriegsflagge, the swastika-adorned war flag, was carried, the crowd did not see the swastika, they saw the casket. And as the family passed, as the crown prince, their kronprinz, walked by, the silence broke. People began to weep, openly, loudly. This was not the contained, respectable grief of a state funeral. This was a raw, primal outpouring of loss. And then it began. A murmur, a chant, that started in the back and rolled forward. They were not shouting, Heil Hitler. They were not singing the Horst Wessel lied. They were chanting Kaiser. They were shouting monarchy. Flowers, bouquets of lilies and roses were thrown from the crowd, not at the military escort, but at the family's carriage. People were shouting, Our prince! Our prince! This was not mourning for a dead soldier. This was a political demonstration disguised as grief. Every flower thrown, every tear shed, every shout of Kaiser was a direct, public, and unmistakable act of defiance. It was 50,000 people in the heart of Prussia, in the midst of a victorious war, telling the Nazi regime, You are not our true masters. Our loyalty is to them. This was the funeral fiasco. The Nazi officials were humiliated, furious, and afraid. They were guests at their own party who had suddenly become the enemy. The event they had tried to co-opt had been hijacked by the ghost of the German Empire. The reports that landed on Adolf Hitler's desk at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia were not dry, bureaucratic summaries. They were panicked, astonished accounts of a monarchist uprising. Hitler's rage was, by all accounts, volcanic. He was a man obsessed with loyalty. He demanded absolute, total, unquestioning loyalty. And what he saw in these reports was the ultimate betrayal. He saw that the aristocracy, the Wehrmacht, and now the people were still infected with this monarchist disease. He saw a state within a state, a rival loyalty that could, at a crucial moment, turn against him. He had just seen 50,000 people prove that their emotional connection to a dead prince was stronger than their ideological commitment to his 1,000-year Reich. He saw the dead Prince Wilhelm not as a hero, but as a martyr for the wrong side. He saw the funeral as a spark, a potential flashpoint for an anti-Nazi, monarchist revival, led by the aristocratic officers in his own army. This was not just paranoia. He had seen the proof with his own eyes, in the panicked reports from his most trusted secret police. The funeral of Prince Wilhelm had done the impossible. It had terrified the Führer. Hitler was not a man who forgot, and he was not a man who forgave. His anger was not just a passing fit. It was a cold, calculating rage, and it was about to be translated into a direct, brutal, and immediate policy. He would make sure that a funeral fiasco like this, that any member of the German royalty becoming a martyr, would never happen again. The price for the public's defiance and for the Hohenzollern family's lingering popularity was about to be paid. Hitler's rage was never just hot air. It was not the passing theatrical fury of a dictator. It was a cold, methodical, and vengeful force. The 50,000 mourners who had gathered in Potsdam on June 3, 1940, had no idea what they had done. In their simple, defiant act of grief, they had signed the death warrant for the entire German aristocracy's role in the military. The funeral fiasco was, for Hitler, the last straw. It was the final, irrefutable proof of a dark fact he had long suspected. The Wehrmacht, his new glorious army, was still dangerously infected with the bacillus of the old world. Its officer corps, especially from the prestigious infantry and cavalry regiments, was dominated by the Junkers, the Vons and the Zoos, the landed Prussian aristocracy. These men in Hitler's paranoid mind were not loyal to him or to National Socialism. They were loyal to their class, to their families, to their Bibles, and, as the funeral had just proven, to their vanished Kaiser. They were a state within a state, a network of blue-blooded cousins and brothers-in-law who held key commands and whose loyalty in a crisis was questionable. They were, in his eyes, unreliable, decadent, and dangerously international, with family connections stretching to England, Sweden, and Russia. Prince Wilhelm's death and the public's reaction to it had given these men a martyr, a rallying point, a good death that could inspire a bad loyalty. Hitler was going to fix that immediately. The order, when it came down from his headquarters just a short time after the funeral, was swift, clinical, and devastating. It was not a public proclamation shouted at a rally. It was a quiet, internal directive, a Führer Erlass, a leader's decree. It has become known to history as the Princenerlass, the Prince Decree. The decree was a masterpiece of bureaucratic malice disguised as concern. The official stated reason was that the regime could not afford the political or public relations fallout of having high-profile members of former royal houses killed in action. It was claimed that the death of a prince in battle was a propaganda victory for the enemy. It was presented as an act of protecting these valuable men from unnecessary risk. This, of course, was a lie, a bald-faced, cynical lie. The real reason, the dark fact behind the ink, was suppression. Hitler was terrified of creating more Wilhelms. He was terrified of more royal funerals turning into monarchist demonstrations. He needed to sever the link, the ancient, almost spiritual bond between the German people and their former ruling families. And the best way to do that was to make them irrelevant. The decree was simple. It banned all members of Germany's former ruling houses, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, the Wettins of Saxony, all of them, from serving in active combat roles in the Wehrmacht. Let's be clear about what this meant. This was not a thank you for your service, now take a desk job. This was a public, deliberate, and deeply humiliating purge. These men, who, like Wilhelm, had been raised from birth on a code of Prussian Dienst and Soldatentum, were now being told by a low-born Austrian corporal that they were unfit to fight, that their blood was a liability. The impact on the aristocratic officer corps was seismic. It was a slap in the face. Wilhelm's brothers, for example, Prince Louis Ferdinand, Prince Hubertus, and Prince Friedrich, were all serving in the military. They, along with dozens of their cousins from Hesse, Bavaria, and Saxony, were now summarily pulled from the front lines. They were reclassified. Some were given meaningless staff jobs in Berlin, far from the action, where the Gestapo could watch them. Others were unceremoniously dismissed from the service altogether, branded as politically unreliable. It was a brilliant and diabolical move by Hitler. With one signature, he had achieved 3 goals. First, he eliminated the risk of any more martyr funerals. Second, he neutered the aristocracy, turning them from war heroes into, in the eyes of the public, shirkers who weren't doing their part. Third, and most importantly, he began to cleanse the Wehrmacht of its old loyalties, making way for a new generation of officers, men who were loyal not to a class or a Kaiser, but only to him. The Princenerlass was just the beginning. It was the first shot in a much broader, quieter war against the aristocracy. The funeral fiasco had put all the old families on a Gestapo watch list. The suppression now became systematic. The surviving Hohenzollerns were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners. Their movements were tracked. Their mail was read. Their phones were tapped. Gestapo agents were a constant, menacing presence at the edges of their lives. This extended, of course, to Wilhelm's grieving widow, Dorothea Schie, who had already been an outsider to the family, was now doubly isolated, a royal widow, but not royal enough, and now the widow of a man whose very memory was a political problem for the regime. She and her two young daughters, Felicitas and Christa, retreated into a forced, protective obscurity, their lives forever defined by the tragedy that the state now wished to forget. And then there was the property. The Nazis had long coveted the vast wealth and estates of the old royal houses. Now, they had the excuse under the guise of war contributions or on trumped-up charges of disloyalty or black market activities. The regime began to put immense pressure on the family's assets. Property was seized. Bank accounts were scrutinized. The message was clear. Your privilege, your wealth, your very safety now exists only at our discretion. This is the dark, unresolved legacy that echoes down to the present day, the root of the modern Hohenzollern family's controversial claims for restitution. They argue that their property was stolen from them, not just by the Soviets after the war, but by the Nazis during it, as part of this political persecution that Prince Wilhelm's funeral had triggered. The regime also began a campaign of historical revisionism. They sought to erase the royal legacy. In new propaganda films, in school textbooks, the role of the Kaisers was downplayed, mocked, or portrayed as a failed precursor to Hitler's true revolution. The Prussian symbols that Hitler loved, the goose step, the uniforms, the obsession with duty, were carefully separated from the people who had created them. He was stealing the symbols of Prussia while purging the Prussians. This hypocrisy was staggering. And what of the family itself? The repercussions of Wilhelm's death and the fiasco that followed were final and absolute. Let's look at the patriarch, the 81-year-old former Kaiser Wilhelm II, now a prisoner in his Dutch manor at Doorn, the country around him occupied by Hitler's armies. He had lost his favorite grandson, Oscar, in Poland. Now he had lost his primary heir, Wilhelm, in France. His grief was profound. He was a broken, bitter old man. He had spent 22 years in exile, deluding himself that the German people, that the army, would one day call him back. The funeral of his grandson, that shocking 50,000-strong demonstration, must have given him one last, flickering, fatal surge of hope. They still love us, he must have thought. They still remember. But the Prinznerlass that followed was Hitler's final answer. It was a brutal no. It was the sound of the last door slamming shut. The Kaiser's health failed rapidly after that. He died almost exactly 1 year after his grandson on June 4th, 1941. His final wish was to be buried in Germany, in Potsdam, with his ancestors, but only after the monarchy had been restored. Hitler, in a final act of cynical, calculated humiliation, considered the request he was advised that bringing the Kaiser's body back to Germany for burial, even in 1941, was still too dangerous. The risk of another Potsdam was too high. The ghost of the Hohenzollerns was still that powerful. So, Hitler compromised. He sent a small, low-level military delegation to the Netherlands. He allowed a correct military funeral at Huisdoorn. The Kaiser was buried in a small mausoleum on the grounds of his exile, where his body remains to this day. He was never allowed to go home, not even in death. Then there was Wilhelm's father, the Crown Prince. For him, the death of his son was the final pathetic end of his life's ambitions. He had lost his son. He had seen his family humiliated by the Prinznerlass, the very regime he had courted. The regime he had helped into power had now turned on him, branding his entire class as unreliable. He spent the rest of the war as a hollow man, a silent figure living on his estates. He was a virtual prisoner, watched by the Gestapo, powerless, and despised by both sides. The Nazis saw him as a reactionary relic, and the anti-Hitler resistance, the brave officers like Stauffenberg, who were plotting to kill the Führer, saw him as a traitor, the man who had held the stirrup for Hitler, the royal collaborator. He was a man who had, quite literally, lost everything: his son, his honor, his family's legacy, and his country. This was the true dark cost of Prince Wilhelm's death. His sacrifice on the battlefield was not the end of the story. It was the trigger. It was the event that exposed the deep paranoid rot at the heart of the Third Reich, and it gave Hitler the excuse he needed to unleash his long-held vendetta. Wilhelm, the prince who had tried to escape his destiny, became in death the very thing he never wanted to be: a symbol so powerful he had to be erased. War ends. But history does not. It simply fractures, leaving behind millions of broken pieces, millions of individual lives that must be put back together, often in a world that no longer makes sense. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Germany that Prince Wilhelm had died for, the Germany his ancestors had built, was not just defeated, it was annihilated. It was a moral and physical ruin, a nation occupied, vivisected, and grappling with the unplumbable horror of the Holocaust. In this new, brutal, and unforgiving landscape, what happened to the woman and the children for whom Wilhelm had given up his crown? His widow Dorothea and his two young daughters, Felicitas and Christa, survived the war. They had lived in the shadow of the regime's disapproval, their lives a quiet, constant navigation of risk. Now they faced a new world. They were aristocrats in a nation that was being forcibly denazified. They were von Preußens in a world where Prussia itself was about to be legally abolished by the Allies, declared the source of all German militarism. They were, in a bitter irony, ghosts of a ghost. Dorothea, the woman deemed a commoner by the Kaiser, now had to raise her two princesses in a world that had no use for them. They lived a life of quiet obscurity, first in West Germany, far from their ancestral homes in Potsdam and Berlin, which were now under Soviet control. Their story became a private one, a tale of survival and resilience, deliberately kept from the public eye. Dorothea, who died in 1972, never remarried. She remained the widow of the prince who had chosen her over an empire. And what of the man himself? What is the legacy of Prince Wilhelm of Prussia? The most profound dark fact of all, the final chilling irony, is that Prince Wilhelm's legacy is that he has no legacy. He has been almost completely erased. Think about it. In the grand sweeping narratives of the Second World War, the epics of D-Day, Stalingrad, the Holocaust, the generals, the politicians, he is not even a footnote. He is a forgotten statistic, one of 5.5 million German soldiers who died in the histories of the German monarchy, the romantic tales of Kaisers and kings. He is a failure. He is the weak prince who renounced his sacred birthright for love. He is the broken link in the dynastic chain, overshadowed by his brother Louis Ferdinand, who became the new heir and the face of the family for the rest of the 20th century. In the memory of modern Germany, a nation rightly focused on confronting the crimes of the Third Reich, he is a tainted figure. He wears the Feldgrau uniform of the Wehrmacht. He is a part of the system, however conflicted he may have been. His family, his father, his uncle are stained by their collaboration. To remember Wilhelm's sacrifice is complicated, uncomfortable. It's easier to simply forget. And finally, in the narrative of the Nazis themselves, he was a man to be deliberately erased. His death was a problem. His funeral was a political crisis. The Prinzenerlass he triggered was an act of systematic suppression. The regime that he died for, the regime that his father had helped into power, wanted him forgotten. He was, in a terrible and complete way, a man who died twice. He died from shrapnel in a Belgian field hospital. And then he was killed a second time by history, his memory buried under the combined weight of Nazi propaganda, post-war guilt, and royalist disappointment. But the story, his dark legacy, does not quite end there. In a final bizarre twist, the ghost of Prince Wilhelm and the collaboration of his father is at the very center of one of the biggest, most explosive political and legal battles in Germany today. For the last several years, the current head of the House of Hohenzollern, Prince Georg Friedrich, who is Prince Wilhelm's grandnephew, has been in a bitter legal fight with the German government. The family is trying to reclaim thousands of items, paintings, sculptures, furniture, books, and even their former palace, Sicilienhof, that were seized by the Soviets in East Germany after 1945. Under German law, a family can be denied this compensation if it can be proven that their ancestors considerably advanced or lent substantial support to the Nazi regime. And suddenly, the entire dark, compromised history of the 1930s is back on trial. The German government's lawyers argue, yes, the Crown Prince, Wilhelm's father, did lend substantial support. He met with Hitler. He publicly endorsed him. He was a Nazi collaborator who helped legitimize the regime. But the Hohenzollern family's lawyers, in a stunning historical maneuver, have a counter-argument, and it revolves around our Wilhelm. Their argument is this: how can you say we supported the Nazis? The Nazis persecuted us. They saw us as a threat. Look at the funeral of Prince Wilhelm. It terrified Hitler. Look at the Prinzenerlass. Hitler purged us from the army. We were not collaborators. We were victims. And there it is, the final dark, tragic irony. Prince Wilhelm's death, his personal sacrifice, his political funeral, and the subsequent purge of his family are being used 85 years later, not as a story of human tragedy, but as a legal defense. His life is a profound and tragic microcosm of the 20th century. It's the story of old world royalty with its rigid codes of blood and duty colliding with the new brutal ideologies of fascism and total war. He was a man who tried to walk a different path, to build a small private life, but he could not escape his name. He could not escape the shadow of the crown he had given away. He was a prince, and he would die as one, his death serving only as a grim political lesson for the dictator his family had helped create. He is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is perhaps something more important. He is a warning. He is a testament to the dark, forgotten, and complex cost of war, and a reminder that the simplest human choices, like who we choose to love, can have the most profound and often tragic historical consequences.